Vajra gave me the title for my talk today, which is Dr Ambedkar healing the world through his sacred vision, through his vision of sacred humanity. And I suppose if we're going to start with a vision of sacred humanity, we have to really start with the Buddha and the Buddha's vision of sacred humanity. So some of you might know with the Buddha's enlightenment, the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and under various trees actually around the Bodhi tree for several weeks, absorbing his enlightenment experience after his enlightenment. And Sangharakshita talks about this very fully, about how, you know, enlightenment wasn't just one experience that just turns on like this, like an idea that you might have one day. It was such a profound, energetic, wholehearted experience. It sort of radiated out in all directions and unfolded in various ways and in various directions. Cognitively, emotionally, volitionally. And one of the interesting things that happened was during this period, just as the Buddha was coming out, the Buddha met a certain Brahmin, we're told. And the Brahmin was called Urgyen, which means like huffing. It's one of those words that sounds what it means, like you know, so and so it says in the text he was a certain overbearing Brahmin, which I think was probably an understatement. And this certain overbearing Brahmin, gave some friendly greetings. He was obviously interested in who this person was. I think, the Buddha carried around with him a certain energy and vitality, which people were attracted to, that they didn't really know why or what he was. Sometimes they asked whether he was a human being or a god. But Urgyen, because he was so wrapped up in his own caste and his own sort of pride, he went straight to the point. He could see, I don't know how he knew, but he could sort of see that the Buddha wasn't a Brahmin, or perhaps he'd asked him whether he was a Brahmin or not, what caste he was from, when he met the Buddha. And he said to the Buddha, "To what extent, Master Gautama, is one a Brahmin? And what are the qualities that make one a Brahmin?" And the Buddha replied to him as a sort of verse of inspiration. He said, "Any Brahmin who has banished evil qualities, not overbearing, not stained, is mind controlled, gone to the end of wisdom, the holy life completed. Rightly would that Brahmin speak the holy teaching. He has no swelling of pride anywhere in the world." So this little episode from the life of the Buddha has huge significance. It has huge significance for Buddhists worldwide, but particularly for Buddhists in India. And in fact, Emperor Ashoka had built a pillar at the spot where this interaction happened, right at the background of the Mahabodhi temple, as you're walking into the Mahabodhi temple, which marks the spot where the Buddha gained enlightenment. And it's a very special sort of place. It's got a number of flowers that people have offered underneath it and covered in gold leaf, just from the marks of pilgrims. Because it has a huge significance that means something from the Enlightenment experience itself, and also something about how society works according to Buddhism. So just to say what that significance is, Brahmanism was being established in northern India at the time of the Buddha. It hadn't quite gained the hold that it has now. But at that time in northern India, it was starting to take hold. And Brahmanism is fundamentally the sort of doctrine that says that society is divided into castes. So you have the Brahmins, the priestly castes. You've got the warriors, which is the caste the Buddha came from. You've got the merchants and the Shudras, the servants. And as the caste system developed, you also started to get a caste underneath that, which was what were known at that time as the untouchables. So this is the system of what Dr Ambedkar called graded inequality. It's like religiously sanctified, very divided society. And you're born into a position that you can't change. So if you're born into the Brahmin caste, you have access to education, ownership of land, religious knowledge. In a way, you're the kind of top of the pile. And if you're one of the lower castes, or even the scheduled caste, which is what Dr Ambedkar called those known as untouchables, you can't have education, you can't have any access to land ownership, you can't visit the temple, and caste system decides who you can be friends with, who you can marry, where you can walk, what wells you can draw water from. It keeps a whole system in place of graded inequality, which is totally immovable. You can't get out of it by anything but birth. And this is a kind of underlying system, but it's kept in place by violence and degradation, humiliation. So sometimes we'll hear on the news sort of acts of really extreme violence in some cases. For example, recently someone from the scheduled caste was beaten to death for eating in front of a higher caste person at a wedding. That's just an example that goes on in India even today. But those systems of extreme violence, in a way, are the sort of grossest manifestation of a system in society that is graded inequality. That's like divided society writ large. It's a very, very ugly thing. And the Buddha is saying that actually you don't become a kind of great man, you don't become a Brahmin. He was trying to redefine the word Brahmin and say, well, it's nothing to do with where you're born. This system is wrong. It doesn't mean anything. You become a great man, you become kind of the top person, you become the highest in society, the holder of religious knowledge, not by what family you're born into, but by who you are, by your ethical practice, your meditation practice, and your wisdom. Basically, you become the greatest person in society by becoming enlightened. Dr Ambedkar paraphrased this as worth, not birth. So he's making a social statement. He's saying it's not, you are who you are not because of the conditions of your birth, but how you shape yourself. And that you can shape yourself to become someone different in society. You can make yourself something in society. So he's making a social statement, but more than that, the Buddha was establishing what it is to be a full human being, what it is to be a great person. There was, if you look at the early dialogues of the Buddha, there's a lot about who's the great man. I mean, this was largely dialogues with men, but I'm sure you could, broaden it out. Who's the great person? Who's the best? What is it, in a way, to be a full human being? What is it to be someone of importance and standing, someone who really does something in society, or is someone in society? And this was a real burning question for people. So the Buddha was establishing what it is to be a full human being and to reach the highest human potential. And for him, the highest human potential was to be an ethical human being, a human being with controlled states of mind, and who can see into the nature of reality. And there's a clear system that then the Buddha drew out of how to get there, which in a way is the path and the goal, because the path to reach to become the sort of highest human potential is ethics, meditation and wisdom, and that is the potential itself. So the Buddha gave the path and the goal. So that's that first moment after the Buddha's enlightenment experience. But if we fast forward 2,500 years and come back to India, what we find is that Buddhism at that time had all but died out in India through various sort of social forces. Buddhism had died out in India, which, Buddhism had been huge in India. I read a statistic that 80% of archaeological remains in India are Buddhist. The government are trying to cover that up, which I've seen in action, actually. I saw this is slightly digressing, but anyway, they found an ancient Buddhist statue, and they just tried to sort of fill it in and posted guards by it so that no one knew. They just don't want any more kind of Buddhist sites, because what it shows is that actually Buddhism was the biggest force in India. 80% of the archaeological remains. Anyway, but 2,500 years after the Buddha had died, Buddhism had all but died out in India. And at that time, a very exceptional human being was born, which we've come to know as Dr Ambedkar. So he was born into that scheduled caste, what was known at that time as the untouchables. But he had access to education partly because his father was in the British Army, and partly because he was sponsored by the Maharaja of Baroda, who's very forward-thinking. And through the guidance of his father and sponsorship by this Maharaja, he gained a PhD in economics a master's and PhD in economics at Columbia University in the US, and a master's and PhD in economics in LSE in London. And he became a barrister at law at Gray's Inn. He was exceptionally intelligent and very, very hard-working. His father used to wake him up at 2 a.m. to study for his exams. So basically, Dr. Ambedkar was just really hardcore. He had incredible stamina and intelligence. And that's not all he had. So he gained that incredible education. And he could have been anything. He could have had a very, very nice life in the UK or in the US. He had this very, very high level of education. He could have just left India, gone to a place with no caste system, and, he could have done very well for himself. But he saw the inequality in his society, and he made a vow that he wouldn't rest until he had removed that inequality. So I know that Amoga City will probably talk to you about that moment, because it's very, very strong. He had a moment where he realised, actually, it's not enough. It's not enough to just live a comfortable life myself when people who've been born into the same situation as me are struggling so much. He himself had his own struggles with caste, and he said, but I'm the most educated man in India. This is bad enough for me. Imagine what it must be like for those who don't have access to education. And he made a vow that he wouldn't rest until he had removed that inequality. So he tried all sorts of means. He tried social action, he tried economic action, he tried putting things in place in law. In fact, he drafted the Indian Constitution at independence. He was the first law minister of independent India. And he wrote this constitution, which if you read the first pages of it, is a thing of great beauty. Of any constitution in the world, it's a thing of great beauty, because it teaches about how society could be, and what it could be to live in an equal and just society. It's a thing of nobility and greatness, this Constitution of India. In a way, it's sort of like a kind of it's almost like a Buddhist text, particularly the preamble, the first bit. So he drafted this thing of beauty, the Constitution of India, and he realised that the forces of social inequality were still in place. And he said the Constitution of India is like a palace on a dung heap. Or he said, I've built a palace and a demon has taken possession of it. Because even though he had the Constitution of India, which was a thing of great beauty and justice, actually without a change in mind, the caste system was still there, the forces of social inequality were still there, and you couldn't make the Constitution of India apply to the whole of society. So he said that in a way you need more than social action and economic action. You need more even than law. What you need is religion. And this is quite a difficult thing for us to take into account. It was interesting because I was teaching about Dr Ambedkar in Eco Dharma, which you might have heard of. is a Buddhist retreat centre in Spain where they train activists. So I went to do a bit of training about Dr Ambedkar because Dr Ambedkar is he's the greatest social activist Buddhist since Ashoka, really, Emperor Ashoka, and he's got some very, very important things to say about activism in general. But we get to this point where I said, okay, so Dr Ambedkar thought you need religion. If you're going to really make deep changes in society, you need religion. And they just were like, no, you don't. No, because religion in the West has this connotation of being undermining equality, and activists usually don't trust religion. It's been known as the opiate of the people, and they see it as a sort of harmful force in society. So it's important to really reflect on why Dr Ambedkar thought we need religion. And one of the major points is he said, well, what else can hold society together? You can't just have law, because law only controls the minority. It can't control everyone. It will only control the people who just go too far. But in terms of the mass of people, you're not going to have like one policeman or woman per person in society. You've got to have a kind of common thread of behaviour that society is following. You can't just keep everything enforced by law. You've got to have more than education, because education can really influence the way we see the world. But actually you need more than what we can learn at school. We need something deeper than that. We need something that's going to influence our beliefs and our basic values about how we live our lives and the standards by which we act. I remember seeing something on Facebook once which said, it doesn't matter what you believe, it's how you act that counts. But of course, how you act is informed by what you believe. And we don't know that because what we believe is so ingrained in us that we can't think outside it, if you see what I mean. The fundamental tenets by which we live, the principles and values that we hold, are influenced by deep, deep beliefs, a deep, deep conditioning that will then influence your behaviour. So in a way it's not enough to say, well, it doesn't matter what you believe, it's how you act. And what you do, how you act, is influenced by what you believe. So what we need, in a way, is we need something that's going to influence our deep values. In a way, you could look at it as something that's going to influence the myth by which we live. And by myth, I don't mean just some sort of made-up story or something, or a superstition. More like a narrative by which we live our lives and what we think is important about the world. What we need is a new imagination. And Dr Ambedkar knew this. He said we need something on which the imagination can fasten. We need something that helps us make sense of the way we live our lives, who we are, how we act in the world. For example, the way Sangharakshita would put that is that humanity is basically one. I think we'd sort of take that for granted, that will be an underlying value. But in a way, that's a religious value. Not everyone would necessarily think that humanity is basically one. And not everyone would act on that basis. So yes, so we need religion because that's what we believe and that's what we live by. That's what we value. The other reason that Ambedkar said that we need a religion is because inequality isn't physical. He said it's not like bricks or barbed wire. It's not something that you can physically counteract. It's produced by the mind, and only the mind can undo it. To really affect inequality in society, you need a revolution of heart and soul. And what is going to do that? What is going to give that revolution of heart and soul? What is going to undo inequality in the mind? Well, that can only be deeply held values, not an idea or even an ideology, but something that's going to really, really transform the root of inequality in the mind. And something that's going to have some sort of actual practice of working on the mind. And that, for Ambedkar, was religion. That was what's going to make that transformation of mind. And the other reason that he thought it was important to have religion was that he had a kind of underlying belief that mankind is essentially religious. And the reason that Dr. Ambedkar thought that was because he himself was very religious-minded. So he said, whatever I've done in my life, whatever good I've done in the world is due to the religious feelings in me. So yes, he had a real feel for the religious life. And you can, you can hear that when he talks about the stories of the Buddha. The last book that he wrote was The Buddha and His Dharma, where he goes through some of the episodes from the Buddha's life. And they're not just a kind of factual information about what happened, as written in the Pali Canon. He feels it. It's when you read Dr. Ambedkar's stories of the Buddha, you know that in his mind he was there. He was there in ancient India, and he was there with the Buddha and the disciples of the Buddha. So Dr. Ambedkar thought that we need religion. And what religion are we to have? Well, it's fairly obvious what the answer is to that particular question, being here. He thought we needed Buddhism. But actually, why he thought we needed Buddhism is interesting. He thought we needed Buddhism because Buddhism gives a vision of humanity living together in a different way, living together on the basis of ethics, meditation, and wisdom. And Ambedkar talks about this in terms of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But he said they're not values that he gained from the French Revolution. They're values that he gained from my master, the Buddha. So the first one is liberty. And liberty really means the freedom to make your own decisions about the course of your life. I think we're very used to having liberty in this society. We're used to being able to have the choice about who we marry, who we hang out with, where we eat, what kind of education that we might like to go into, what kind of job that we want to have, what kind of religion that we want to follow. All these things come very naturally to us, but actually for a great portion of the world, they don't have that kind of liberty. You have to, you're born into a particular situation, and that will control what job you can do, who you can marry, where you can eat, where you can sit, what road you can walk down, where you can get water from. All these kind of basic human decisions. And that's not okay. I mean, just to give you an example of this, an Indian friend came to stay with us in Triratna the other day. And the first thing I said to her, I said, well, when you're here in rural Wales, you're free to go for a walk. And she went, well, I can just walk on my own. And I said, yes, you can walk on your own. You can walk on your own anywhere. And if you see someone, they'll just say, good afternoon. And possibly, being British, they'll talk about the weather. So you have a nice little chat about the weather, which is always variable, slightly in Wales on the side of rain, and then you get on with your business. And she had tears in her eyes because you can't do that in large parts of India. You can't just go for a walk on your own. So that kind of freedom I would just take for granted. I can walk for hours, I can walk for days, I can walk at midnight in the fields around our home. In fact, I regularly do, tripping over, wandering about, looking at the moon. And my only thought is whether I'm going to trip over something. It's not that anyone's going to do me any harm. So yes, the liberty that we take for granted, it doesn't apply to everybody. And maybe it won't apply to us forever. You know, we have a Sangha in Turkey. And of course, if they're found out to practice the Dharma by the government, they could be arrested and imprisoned. So, it's worth bearing in mind. So yes, so liberty, equality. And in a way, equality means really that every individual respects the individuality of another. So Dr. Ambedkar said it's not everyone is equal in every way, but that they should have the same opportunities, whatever circumstances they're born into. And they might not make use of their opportunities in the same way. They might do something different with it, but without equal opportunity as a starting point, selection will be based on selection of the privileged rather than selection of the able. So he's just saying that every individual should respect the individuality of another. And then you can decide your own sort of fate. You can shape your own life, but you'll shape it from the same sort of starting point. And of course, in all societies, I think we've got a long way to go to have that every individual respects the individuality of another. But the most important basis of a different vision of humanity is fraternity. And Dr. Ambedkar said that this underlies liberty and equality. You can't have liberty and equality without fraternity. And what that really is seeing all people as my people. And more than that, it has to be based on Maitri. So for Dr. Ambedkar, fraternity means Maitri, it means metta, it means love. It's essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards one's fellow men. And I think that's a very beautiful way of describing metta, actually. An attitude of respect and even reverence. You reverence the life in another, and you reverence the life in another because you can resonate with their life. You can feel the life in yourself, and you can feel the life in them. And there's a reverence that emerges from that. We might not all get on, we might not think eye to eye, we might annoy each other, we might fall out, we might fall in love. But it's keeping that sense of respect and reverence, even reverence, seeing the life, the essential life in another human being. And this, of course, really, when I started to study Dr. Ambedkar, it brought to mind a very, very important talk of Sangharakshita's called Buddhism, World Peace and Nuclear War, which I think particularly if you are interested in social action is really worth reading. It's quite an exceptional paper. And in it he says something very, very beautiful. He says, in order to achieve peace, world peace, in this fuller sense, we shall have to deepen our realization of the indivisibility of humanity and act on that realization with even greater consistency. We shall have to regard ourselves as citizens of the world in a more concrete sense than before. We shall have to identify ourselves more closely with all living things and love them with a more ardent and selfless love. We shall have to be louder and clearer. We shall have to be a louder and clearer voice of sanity and compassion in the world. So for Sangharakshita, that vision of metta is really also what underlies a different vision of humanity and world peace, a realization of the indivisibility of humanity. And we need this because it's not enough to just change governments. It's not enough to change the law or to change the social structure of society. And even if you got what you wanted, even if you outlawed caste discrimination, even if you changed the government, even if all governments took climate change seriously and had zero carbon emissions, even if our government stood with the Kurds in Syria or ended all wars, even if we stayed in the EU, which, some of us may want and some of us may not, even if you got everything you wanted from the government and in society, what happens next? Well, what happens next is the old problems resurface and divisions take hold again. And of course, that's what we've seen. You've seen we've had a long period in this country and in Europe of peace and respect for each other. But underneath there, the old surfaces, the old traumas, the old injustices, the old inequality is ready to come out again. And, I live with someone who grew up in the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and she's frightened. What happens if you get a hard border in Northern Ireland? The tensions are still there. It's not like you've removed the causes of the war in the first place. The problems are still there waiting to arise. Racism was waiting to arise in America, in the US. and racism and hatred is still in this society ready to rise given the conditions. And Panti and Dr Ambedkar saw this. What they saw is you need a revolution of being. You need to destroy inequality in the mind. And what's going to do that? Well, Buddhism can do that because it's a path of practice. It's a path to the realization of human potential. It's a path to ethics, meditation, and wisdom. And it's a social vision, but it's also a vision of the individual and what the individual is capable of. Because even before enlightenment itself, it makes us into what Sangharakshita called true individuals. And both Bhante and Dr Ambedkar saw this as the Buddha's gift. In a way, it makes us into great men and women, even before enlightenment. It makes us, I don't really think in terms of great men and women, what I think in terms of is substantial human beings moving towards their potential. And that's what the world needs. The world needs substantial human beings. For Sangharakshita, those people are emotionally positive, creative, able to think and act independently, and are ethically responsible. And Dr Ambedkar really had this common vision with Sangharakshita. I think this is one of the points where they really meet on their philosophies. Ambedkar advocated in his followers a sense of potency and self-responsibility and not giving way to feelings of victimhood. You know, actually Dr Ambedkar is really hard to read because when he's giving a speech, and he's often giving it speech to people who've been socially oppressed for generations, and he's saying to them things like, from time immemorial, you've hugged your own helplessness. You know, he's not just saying you poor things. He's saying you've got to get up. You've got to be lions. Don't be under the illusion someone will come and emancipate you. You must abolish slavery yourselves. And he saw that the mental state of victimhood would keep people stuck and leads to inaction and blame, which is just a demotivator. You know, blame just keeps you stuck in the same position. You've categorized yourself as a victim and the other person as a perpetrator, and you're waiting for a rescuer. And it keeps you just stuck in that cycle. And I have to say, you know, meeting many Buddhists in India and being in the order, you just never get a sense of victimhood. That's not what Buddhist practice is about. In a very moving speech he gave in 1936, he describes the quality of someone who's free. And these qualities come very close to Sangharakshita's description of the individual. He says, mere physical freedom is of no use. Freedom of mind is of prime importance. A person whose mind is not free, though they are not in chains, is a slave. To whom can we say their mind is free? I call them free who with consciousness awake realizes their rights, responsibilities and duties. Those who are not a slave of circumstance and are always bent upon changing them in their favour, I call them free. One who is not a slave of usage, customs and traditions, or of the teachings because they're brought down from the ancestors. One whose flame of reason is not extinguished, I call them free. Those who are not afraid of public criticism, who have enough intellect and self-respect so as to not become a doll in the hands of others, I call such a person free. Those who do not lead their life under the direction of others, who carve out their own aim of life according to their own reason, who decide themselves as to how in what way that life should be led, I call them free. In short, someone who is the master of their own life, them alone I consider free. So I find this very moving about Dr Ambedkar. Someone who is the master of their own life, them alone I consider free. And it calls to mind in me this first statement that the Buddha gave to this huffing Brahmin. You know, who is free? Who is substantial? Who is great? Someone who has controlled their own mind, who is master of their own life. And it calls to mind a combination of dignity and responsibility and creativity that I think really are they're the foundations and they're also the outcomes of Buddhist practice. And this is what we kind of need in society. It's wiping out a certain mental attitude that if you've been told you're worthless and you believe you're worthless, you'll lead a worthless life. You'll lead a little life. But if you're told you're great and you believe you're great, you'll do great things. Because the main thing that really keeps people down is their own belittlement. And I think we can have a kind of fear of strength. There's a very beautiful moment actually with Upagupta, who was about 100 years after the Buddha lived, who's a great enlightened being. And he has these whole interactions with Mara, which eventually culminate in him converting Mara to the Dharma and predicting his future Buddhahood. It's a great story. But there's this moment where he looks at Mara, who's being quite naughty at that particular moment, I have to say. And he says, "Show whatever powers you have, but today you have encountered a son of the Buddha." It's a bit like that. In a way, there are many things wrong in society. There's many forces of inequality, injustice and hatred. But show whatever powers you have, because today you've encountered a son or a daughter or a child of the Buddha. And I think this is really why I'm an order member. Because I see in Dr Ambedkar's vision of human potential and sacred humanity, the potential of what it can be to become an order member. That's why I've clearly worked so hard to help in the ordination process. And I really believe in that. I really believe in that in this country, obviously working for the ordination team here, but also in India. That's why I want to contribute whatever I can to the Indian situation, which, mainly for me is money. Because we can create people who are free. We can give people the practice to become substantial human beings who can make a difference in the world, who can move through the world with dignity and respect and responsibility and creativity. So I just wanted to finish really with just two images from India. There's lots of things that I've seen in India over the years. And one of the most affecting things I've seen is that we went in the pilgrimage in 2011, some time of old. Anyway, we went in the Sheffield pilgrimage and we went to the Dr Ambedkar Museum outside of Nagpur, which is actually really depressing because they've just got all his things and they're all stuck up with sellotape, including his lungi and his socks and everything. And I went round with a Mogavanksa, and I've made a vow to a Mogavanksa that when he dies, I'm just going to burn all his underwear. So, so you can't put them in a museum with bits of sellotape. And it's shameful that they would do it with a bodhisattva like Ambedkar. But anyway, so we were all a bit upset by that, actually. The pilgrimage were upset. We were quite quiet, which was unusual. And there was this sign outside the museum that says Dharma Training Institute for Dharma teachers. And that sign was just a piece, just labelling a piece of scrubland. Just nothing was there. There was a fence and nothing was built. And I said to Mani Dharma at the time, I said, what happened? There's the plaque. Where's the building? He said, oh, they just sort of argued amongst themselves and squandered the money. So that didn't happen. Another thing that I've seen in India, which shows something actually about how to, if we're going to create something, we have to create it together. But the other thing that I saw was, I was at the Mahabodhi temple and there was I was sitting meditating, and in front of me was a young man. And I'm very sensitive to people's feelings in meditation, the energy that they're giving off. And this young man was, I thought, well, he's definitely in dhyana. He's in highest meditative states. There was a kind of atmosphere and feeling of purity and just peace, actually, and dignity coming off this young man. And he sat there for a long time, very, very still, very concentrated. It's quite noisy at the Mahabodhi temple, but he just sat there very still. And the more he sat there and the more he was still, and I was meditating, and then I finished meditating and he was still there, I was intrigued by who he could be. I started even to wonder whether I sort of made him up. Maybe he was a deva. And I just waited to see who he was. And eventually he got up, a young man wearing quite simple clothes. And he turned around and he had this kind of badge, this sort of little label on a piece of ribbon. And what that was a little sign, because he was on the Mitra Convention in India. And at that moment he turned around and I smiled at him, he smiled back, walked off. And I was so proud. I was thinking, oh, we're doing something here. We're enabling this young man to really be who he could be. I don't know who he is or what his name was or what he does with his life, but I knew he'd got something. He'd got the Dharma. And I thought, well, it's worth it. It's worth it for people like you. All the work that I do is worth it for people like you. So yes, so much is needed, so much a time of great uncertainty and turmoil. And what can we do? Who can we be in the midst of that? What can we give? Well, we can give a vision of humanity living together on the basis of fraternity, on the basis of metta. We can give a vision of human potential, of ethics, meditation and wisdom. And we can give that vision to people by becoming that vision ourselves. And Ambedkar showed that it's possible to do that. It's possible to live out that vision and become that vision. He said, the duty of a Buddhist is not just to be a good Buddhist. The duty of a Buddhist is also to serve mankind. And we serve mankind by practicing the Dharma and enabling others to do so too. So I'm very pleased to be able to celebrate Dr. Ambedkar, and I really hope that his life gives you some inspiration for your Dharma practice and your Dharma work. And if you can, do read Dr. Ambedkar and Buddhism.